Well, hello and welcome. This is video number 2 in a 3-part series on the Atlantic world, and the focus of the video today is going to be on the Atlantic slave trade. So with that, we'll get started. All right, so up to this point, if you've been working through some of the videos I've made, we've talked about the European countries sailing west across the Atlantic Ocean, looking for an opportunity to get to where a lot of the trade goods originated from that Europe was interested in at the time. Of course, as they sailed across the Atlantic Ocean, as we well know today, they didn't exactly get to their destination. They ended up finding something altogether new, but not to simply get upset that they didn't meet their original goal. Countries decided to try to make a go of where they were and what they had discovered. And one of the things that they soon figured out was that if you were going to make money in the Americas, you were going to need to do so by getting involved with agricultural activities. The thing they hoped that they would find first when they realized they weren't able to make connections with those trading areas that they had hoped to was they hoped to find gold and silver lying around, and they certainly did find some gold and silver, but not nearly enough for them. And as time went by, it was pretty clear there were money-making opportunities, but they were going to be not only agricultural in nature, at least at this point in time, but pretty labor-intensive. And so when you talk about what was going on in the Americas, first of all, I think it's important to know that we're talking about both North and South America. So this is not the Atlantic slave trade focused on the situation of slavery that would develop in the present-day United States. That's a part of it. But we're also talking about the Caribbean region. We're talking about South America. We're talking about the Americas overall. And so especially depending on exactly where you were, there might be somewhat different specific agricultural operations that were in play. But two of the biggest that were happening by the early 1500s were sugar plantations and tobacco plantations. Great money-making opportunity. Needed lots of workers. Now, one of the things that would have likely been true had disease not been a factor is the indigenous people of the Americas quite likely would have brought in either voluntarily or involuntarily to serve as workers for the people who owned these plantations. But the reality was, with disease and illness, the population of the Americas, the people who had originally been here, was pretty well decimated, some places worse than others. And so as far as a labor force was concerned, one of the options that was available to Europeans at this point was to use enslaved people from Africa. Now, not only was this an abundant labor supply, but also a relatively inexpensive one. Now, as far as this as an option for the Europeans, I think it's important to understand that slavery is not something that developed with the development of North and South America by European countries. I mean, slavery in and of itself is something that has essentially been around as long as civilization has been around. Now, exactly how it plays out at different places at different times certainly varies. As far as Africa as a place for the slave trade, that had been well established going back as early as the year 650. So by the time Europeans got involved with the slave trade for the Americas, slavery and the slave trade in Africa had been around for approaching 1,000 years. In fact, many millions of people had been captured in war and then turned into slaves and taken to various parts of the Middle East and Asia over those centuries. And so, for example, when Portugal began sailing down the west coast of Africa, one of the things that they encountered was the slave trade. Now, they were not particularly interested at that stage in trading anything they had for people. They were interested in gold, most specifically. But once these big plantations would begin to develop in the Americas, then knowledge of the slave trade and what it could do for them definitely was enticing, and you begin to see Europe make contact with, most specifically, the western coast of Africa to make purchases for people to be used as labor in the Americas. Now, one thing that does begin to be a little different than the way slavery often was practiced, at least as it relates to the Americas, is it would become a hereditary institution, one where if you had children, that they would be born into slavery and they themselves would be slaves. One thing about a lot of the slavery that had gone on in the prior centuries is that only the person who was enslaved was a slave, that it wouldn't be passed on to their offspring. Also, opportunities certainly would vary depending on where you were and what the nature of the slavery was. So definitely slavery in the Americas took a different course than had maybe been more or less true in a lot of other places, and one that was definitely nastier and more hurtful and harmful over a long period of time. As far as the advantages of using people from Africa as the labor supply, there were quite a few advantages, and if you try to look at this as from a business perspective, and somebody trying to as efficiently as possible run a business, there were definitely a lot of advantages to using the slave system that was in place and then bringing those people to the Americas. One thing, as far as diseases were concerned, anybody living in Africa was exposed to anything that anybody else had ever been exposed to, so disease wasn't really an issue. Many of the people, in fact, the majority of the people that were enslaved and brought over to the Americas already had agricultural experience. So as far as the efforts you would have to go into to train people to do what you needed them to do, that went pretty smoothly and pretty easily. Now, the next couple advantages start to be definitely on the sinister side. True advantages, but certainly not the kind of thing that is easy to feel very good about. And that was when you bring people from one part of the world and deposit them in another part of the world, it's something that they're unfamiliar with. They have no connections to. So as far as being captive and in a worse position, or the worst position of all, to try to escape the situation they were in, that was viewed as an advantage. And then the fact that their skin color was different. For people who maybe did have the idea of escaping the situation they were in, or chose to do so, it was going to be a lot more difficult to blend in with other groups of people that they might encounter. And so those were viewed as advantages as well. So from the standpoint of trying to, as efficiently as possible, run a plantation, there was a lot to be gained by using enslaved people from the continent of Africa. Now, as far as the numbers and where people went to, where they came from, Spain and Portugal were the two most significant countries out of Europe involved with the slave trade, at least in terms of the number of people that they enslaved and brought over to the Americas to various areas. Altogether, in the neighborhood of around 10 million people were brought over to the Americas as slaves. And I've got a couple of maps here that I'll zoom in on here in the next couple of clicks that'll let you see this a little closer. Now, as far as North America goes, because that's probably most relevant to us, there was a much smaller number of people brought into North America compared to a lot of other places in the Americas. Brazil was the area where you had the greatest number of people taken. But one thing that will be different, a little different about North America, is the conditions were actually enough relatively better compared to a lot of places. Even though there were less actual people brought into slavery in North America, a lot more people survived, reproduced, and the number of people who were enslaved people living in North America would grow to be fairly sizable, approaching 2 million people by the time it was all said and done. Now, again, on the next couple, let's just zoom in on some of these maps. And you can see really throughout the western part of Africa is where people were purchased. And one thing to keep in mind, this was not an example of Europeans going to Africa and capturing people to use as slaves. The marketplace existed. It was African people who were capturing people to sell into slavery. So it was a process that had a lot of different parts to it and a lot of different people involved to make it happen. Here's just simply another map that shows where people were taken. Again, you can see the biggest majorities of people taken to where Brazil is at today and into the Caribbean region, smaller number of people into North America, and even smaller number of people actually taken on into Europe as well. Now, just a couple other terms to mention that are some terms to be familiar with the Atlantic slave trade, that being triangular trade and middle passage. The triangular trade just refers to the three-point trade network that existed through this process, where basically you had, starting in Europe with finished goods like guns, for example, were brought to Africa to be used to trade for people. People taken to the Americas to be the labor supply, and then raw materials picked up in the Americas, taken back to Europe to be used in any number of ways on through finished products. Now, there's obviously a lot more that can be said about slavery and the slave trade. For our purposes, we're going to keep it simple and go ahead and sign off at this point. But as far as the Americas having an opportunity to grow and thrive, the slave trade was definitely a part of that. And that's not meant as a justification or to say that it was okay or worth doing, but it is definitely true that it was a big role with things being able to develop the way they did. And yeah, I think we'll go ahead and just leave it at that for now. And I appreciate you watching. Hopefully you'll join me for future videos. Thanks.